Welcome to Intertek's Healthy Building Series, a forum dedicated to exploring the crucial intersection of design, construction, and the goal to create healthy, environmentally responsible, and efficient buildings. Today's discussion centers on acoustics, and our subject matter expert is Jeff Fullerton, Department Manager of Acoustics for Intertek's Building and Construction Division. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us today. For those who don't know who you are, can you share with everyone your background and current role with Intertek?
Sure. I've been with Intertek just over 7 years, and I've been a consultant in acoustics for over 25, basically working with architects, engineers, and owners on optimizing the acoustics of their projects. And that might range from projects that are multifamily, mixed use, to projects that include workspaces or educational spaces to performance spaces. Acoustics plays an important role in many building types. One of the biggest things we're busy with these days are the hours from data centers. So we're trying to make those good neighbors for everybody. So acoustics is a fun field. There's a lot of creativity, and LEED is one of the ways in which we're seeing some great advances of our field.
Well, that's great. So you're leading right into our discussion today, which is lead. Can you talk a little bit about, because we're gonna talk about acoustics, how it relates to lead, and what is that kind of that intersection between the two?
Yeah, so I've been involved with LEED since way back in 2000, and LEED started even before then. Acoustics didn't play a role when it first started. It was really focused more on sustainability and sort of optimizing materials to achieve buildings with better content, energy efficiency, and more health environments because of the selection of materials. I was involved with LEED back in 2000 to help develop acoustical guidelines for corporate spaces and office spaces. And so it was a fun process for me to basically learn about an industry that was really trying to change the world. And in the process, I was helping introduce how acoustics plays a part in healthy buildings, in that acoustics really can make or break whether a building is successful for the occupants. And people think of successful buildings as something that looks beautiful or has low carbon materials or has recycled material content. And all of those are important. And likewise, energy efficiency is important and water efficiency and things like that. But if a building isn't comfortable acoustically, not many people want to stay there. And so acoustics fits well into the high performance building discussion, and LEED is really driving the high performance building discussion, trying to set all those benchmarks for what does a high performance building try to accomplish. And so acoustics is over the years has slowly evolved into LEED, and over time has grown more detailed in its elements and also the project ranges that it covers. So it's been a fun evolution to develop since those early 2000 days when I was first involved. And I think now we're actually seeing the benefit of that in the buildings that are coming out.
So, Jeff, you talk about the evolution of acoustics in lead. I'm curious, what really was the starting point of that? What really drove acoustics as an element of lead? Because I do remember when lead first started, I don't remember acoustics really being part of it at all.
Yeah, no, it took a little while for acoustics to work into it. And I think one of the things in my career that I found is LEED has a lot of similarities to lighting. And lighting is a feature of a building that allows people to feel better about the environment they're in. And I think a lot of the studies on daylighting and natural lighting and things like that helped open up people's eyes to the fact that not only is lighting important for energy efficiency and how do you select the right fixtures and how do you get in daylight so that you can supplement the light that we actually use from electricity, but it's very similar to acoustics in that you want the right light and the right amount of light and have that as optimized for the occupants. And acoustics eventually has gotten us there. And interesting, in the interim of the beginning of LEED to maybe the mid 2010, early 2000 teens, there were actually studies done by the Center of the Built Environment where they found that out of all the things that LEED was accomplishing in new buildings, LEED certified buildings, many of the things were much better. Energy efficiency was better, water efficiency was better, lighting was better. One of the things that actually got worse was the And it was because it wasn't on the checklist for LEED.
Mm.
And so, as these studies were showing post occupancy sort of dissatisfaction with acoustics, even in these wonderful LEED buildings, they realized that acoustics was part of the solution. And so, it's gotten its way into acoustics. It started with version 3, but really became much more solidified in version 4 and subsequent versions, that now it's part of that checklist and part of that element that all designers for a LEED certified project need to say, geez, do we want good acoustics in here, or should we go to the next credit? And by having it at least part of the discussion, people can select whether or not they're going to do it. And in most cases, it's actually just good practice.
So, Jeff, I like the analogy with lighting because when you walk into a space, right away you can tell good lighting versus bad lighting. And I think acoustics are very similar, particularly if you're in a setting where you're having meetings or there's communication going, whatever it may be. You really tell the difference between good acoustics and bad acoustics in a space.
Yeah. And it's funny. So there's a great book called Blind or Architects and Blind Acousticians, and it basically focuses on the fact that so many people are visually driven. And as we think about a space that's being rendered and envisioned, most of the time it's a visual representation. And the acoustics are so to also think of in that rendering and think of what as to what the final goal is going to be. So again, so important that it's gotten into LEED, and so important that as LEED version 5 comes out, that it stays that relevant and important element of good practice and design for the occupants of the building.
So, Jeff, can you talk a little bit about the approach to assessing the acoustic needs of a building project for LEED certification?
Sure. So when we look at a LEED project, we will often start with where the site is located and look at the outdoor noises that might enter. After we understand that, we can then turn to how is the space divided, and then look at the mechanical systems that have to heat and cool that building. And then finally, we look at the finishes within the rooms. And those often are the main acoustical issues that every building has to look at.
So, how do you determine the appropriate background noise levels for different spaces within a building that considers LEED requirements for occupant comfort, as we've talked about?
Well, so LEED is often based on other good practice guidelines that are out there, and ASHRAE and ANSI, those organizations that had documents that were good baseline, good best practices to use, and LEED has brought them into its requirements for its criteria. So those are the guidelines that we use, and for LEED, they just become the requirement. And they all are based on what type of activity is occurring in these spaces. And for spaces where you're instructing and where speech is important, there are quieter sound levels so that the intelligibility of speech is good, not just for those of us with normal hearing, but also those English might be a second language, or for those with hearing impairments. And so those background sound levels are often very low in a way that hopefully it's inclusive for everyone. Open workspaces, you actually would rather it not have pin drop silence. If you have pin drop silence in your open workspace, you actually become more distracted. And so there are actually goals in LEED that you actually want to add sound, it's called sound masking, to provide a reasonable amount of background sound and make it more comfortable for people to work in.
So, Jeff, we know leads are kind of all about their point system, right? So, when you're achieving lead points related to sound isolation in the acoustic space, what design strategies do you typically recommend for when it comes to walls, floors, ceilings? What are those strategic recommendations that you typically make?
Yeah, so one of the challenges with LEED is that the points are limited. And so you have to make sure you're going all in for everything, because the sound isolation of all those spaces within the building are considered part of one point and one credit. So you look at the strategies. How do we achieve this for the most challenging spaces, which might be a loud space next to a quiet space? And how do we do that with the wall construction that's needed there? Versus the more typical spaces, which might be more moderate. You can do a less substantial wall to integrate without adding too much cost or adding too much extra in materials. So it's really looking at that balance of how do you need to achieve your most challenging goal and also your more typical goal for all of the spaces to earn the credit.
And I have to assume that the level of acoustics and the amount of effort and energy can be based on the space itself. So if it's an auditorium or a music hall or a classroom, is going to dictate the level of where acoustics really come into play. Is that a fair statement?
Correct. All of the goals for those performance spaces where the acoustics plays a central role in the success of that space, those guidelines usually require quieter sound levels, greater isolation. And at the same time, they produce more sound, so that greater isolation also needs to protect those other spaces next to it. So, yes, all of those are factored into the goals that you're designing for. And again, in a way, it makes it a good checklist, good practice and good design.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jeff, what types of acoustical materials are most effective for achieving lead requirements while also considering factors like aesthetics and certainly cost, which is obviously the top of everybody's list?
I am so fortunate to work in an industry that has made so many advances in materials since when I started. And there are different ways to look at that question. There are what products are available to block sound and isolate spaces. And today we have products in the drywall category that are actually laminated pieces of drywall that act like a laminated window and reduce sound more than a traditional layer of drywall. There's also modern drywall that is lighter weight, meaning that there's less transportation energy spent. Those layers are raising a concern because lower weight usually doesn't block sound as well, but we're actually finding with all the elements put together, those lighter weight drywall change the acoustics too significantly. You do want to review it, but oftentimes it works out successfully. On the other side, we've got the sound absorbing materials. And again, we've seen some amazing advances in the last 25 years of products that plaster but are sound absorbing and take the sound out of the space by absorbing it so that you don't have that long reverberance. You also have a great extent of recycled products that are coming available as the
Mm.
plastics are being built. PET felt panels are available, and those can provide very good and effective sound absorption. And then all of the manufacturers are trying to, again, position their products for the best energy and environmental sustainable design that they can. All manufacturers push for things like plant-based fibers. And it's exciting. We've got a lot to choose from, and it's fun because oftentimes these products are not only checking the acoustical box, but they're checking a material and resources box, whether it's recycled, renewable, or something in a way that's helping the project and other benefits.
Well, that was kind of my thought as you were talking through that. I can see multiple lead points beyond the design with also the material side, right? To some of those new technologies and innovations out there.
Correct. That's where it can be a win-win to select some of these products. You get that recycled content or renewable content credit, but you're getting the better acoustics at the same time. And so that's where, again, we try in our daily practice to steer people this direction. Not everyone's trying to do that in non-lead projects, but with lead, it makes sense in those two factors.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk testing. Intertek does a lot of testing. So can you explain the process of testing and verifying compliance with lead acoustical performance criteria?
Sure. So Intertek is a very large testing organization, and we test everything from building facades to the acoustics. And one of the things that we like to find out is how did the design turn in the execution that the contractors built? And what's the final installed condition? And in many cases, we're finding great success. The contractors were given a good design by the architects and engineers. The contractors have executed in the way they purchased products that were specified and they've installed it correctly, and we're seeing great success. We've tested a good number of schools and also higher education facilities, and those tests are showing that you're getting the very separation between spaces, you're getting the right reverberation within spaces to allow people to hear the conversations they need to hear. And the mechanical systems are often very quiet because they're energy efficient, and that's helping achieve that goal also.
So testing, and then we got consulting, which is another big area that Intertek gets involved with. So how do you consult with architects or interior designers and other building professionals to integrate acoustical considerations in the overall design process?
Yeah, and here's where it's a fun cyclical process in that if we're out testing, we get to learn a lot about what might go wrong. And so, in the process of learning that, we actually feed that back to our consulting practice, which is able to, again, work with architects and engineers to incorporate the best practices and lead requirements for the credits right into the design so that execution that's provided to, or the design that's given to the contractor can be executed properly. Yeah, it's fun being on both sides of that, getting to see other people's the creativity they've applied, but also bringing some of our own creativity to projects that we work with architects and helping them solve challenges that their design is introducing.
So can you, with the audience, can you share a few examples, some maybe some projects you've recently worked on where that all kind of comes into play with the consulting and the testing?
Sure. So, here locally in the Boston area, there's a new laboratory building that just opened up in the last year or so. And one of the things that LEED required, or actually one of the credits that the project was a pilot credit for exterior noise. And so, this being a lab building has a lot of ventilation that goes into it to provide fresh air, but also a lot of ventilation to take exhaust air out. And in this project, we basically worked with the engineer to design the systems to be very quiet. There's a residential facility not too far away, and the goal was let's have our lab building function without interrupting that residential building. And the fun part was being able to go out after and show that it worked out successfully. And residents are happy. They've got a very exciting, brand new lab building that will house some of the greatest research in the Boston area that's going on and advancing some of the technology and sort of the biopharma side, and they don't have to listen to it all the time. And so it's exciting to see that synergy of being able to do that program and that occupancy, even if it's right next to residences.
I'm curious, Jeff, with a on a project side for an architect or building owner, if they know they're going down this path, are they budgeting a certain amount for the consultation or testing or in the typical flow of a project? Is that segmented out separately?
Yeah, that's a good question because brought in on the consulting side, oftentimes our consulting services are provided to the architect, and hopefully that's been budgeted into their fees, and the developer knew that was coming. We help them through the design side of things, and then help them as they work with the execute the design and get the installed conditions correct. The testing side is often a piece that someone might be brought in as a third party. We also have been brought in as the consulting party, checking to make sure that it's been executed properly. So those are sometimes thought of early in the project, but oftentimes as you're getting near the end of the project, those are the thoughts that are sort of check boxes, let's say, that
Right.
are added to the end. That again, it's fun to go see a success and also to learn from failure if that were to happen. But yeah, the testing is always the proof of the pudding, sure that it's actually working. And those are fun experiences to see.
How about on the retrofit side? Are you ever called in on an existing building and they, let's say all of a sudden, there's a new airport opened up or the urban noise is just so loud? Is that common for you to get involved with projects like that?
Yeah, those do happen. And with things like airports, usually somebody knows if an airport
Right.
be flying planes near you, but things like trains and highways and roadways are changing, and things like that can affect the interior occupants. So we do get involved with those. Probably the other side of that is seeing a lot of adaptive reuse of buildings. And so in the Boston area, we have a lot of historic buildings that used to be old warehouses, and they're wonderful, strong buildings, wonderful beautiful brick construction with timber interiors. They were never for any acoustical purpose. And so
Right.
oftentimes our challenge is how do you turn a building that was never intended to separate spaces for acoustics into a productive facility for residences or office spaces? Those are the typical uses, although we have seen a lab building also. So it's fun to apply creativity on those projects to really bring together the solutions that you need to make the building work successfully for the occupants.
Great. So let me ask you about LEED version 4 and the newer version 4.1. How do the two differ when it comes to acoustics, or do they? Are there differences in there that people should be aware of?
Yeah, thankfully, there's not a lot of differences between the two. Very similar on the acoustic front. There were changes in the other areas which were important to understand, but from the acoustic perspective, they're very similar. I think we're really looking forward to what that next version 5 is going to be, and there's been a public comment section or public comment series, and they're planning some changes. I think one of the challenges we saw is they're trying to do some things that might be easier and less impact for the designers to meet and the owners to meet. And I think our concern as an industry, the acoustical industry, is that we still have that checklist of what people need to do, and we can't just say do good acoustics and you'll get a credit. We have to tell people what that means, because it does change based on your building type. And I think people often think of acoustics as subjective enough that you can name your own goal. I think as an industry, we've found that there are some very well established goals that are useful to use to make sure that we're getting the right types of occupancy successful.
Yeah, absolutely. Beyond the standard acoustical credit opportunities, other possible credits might people pursue in LEED?
Yeah, so for a long time, acoustics was just an innovative credit. And so it wasn't in the list of different things you could choose from. You could apply for an innovative credit about the acoustics that you did on your project and submit that and earn a credit in the ID portion of LEED. So that worked. But again, since it wasn't on the main check things, I think there was a small proportion of projects that was accomplishing that. So having LEED work into the interior environment or the indoor environmental quality section was really a great step forward. And now we're seeing that you can still do some innovative things with the other side of it, but it's not the way you accomplish your credit for acoustics. You can get it through the IEQ section. The other side is we also have this pilot credit for exterior noise, which I mentioned for about this lab building. It's another great credit because if you're designing your project to be a good neighbor, you can often get credit for that.
Hmm.
And in many communities, the regulation is how you define what a good neighbor is. And we have to meet those regulations. And if you can make it a little quieter than that, again, is going to support you in that. And again, it's a good way for buildings to not only be sustainable, but be successful on so many levels for the neighbors that they're around.
Wow, Jeff, a lot of great information. Again, really appreciate your time. Is there anything I didn't ask you that's worth sharing with our audience today?
Yeah, I think just utilize the resources in our industry. We've got a wonderful industry of consultants, and if you haven't met one that you need some guidance, reach out to the Noise National Council consultants, because you'll find a lot of great consultants all across the states. And we're certainly interested in helping you, but we may not be your most local resource, and we certainly want to make sure you get the support you need.
Great. Jeff, thanks again. And to everyone, thanks for joining us. If you want to hear more about high performance buildings related to LEED, check out our LEED Well and Resilience interviews with Alan Scott, and we'll put the link below so you know where to go. Great video interviews as this was. Jeff, thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Shawn.